The entire chip world swore you could not build an advanced chip without a $200 million Dutch machine called an EUV scanner, and then a phone showed up in China with a 7-nanometer chip inside, stamped in Shanghai, with no such machine anywhere in the building. Before we go one step further, subscribe and turn on notifications so the next China breakthrough finds you before the headlines do. For years, the West told itself a very comforting story. To make a truly modern chip, the tiny brain inside every fast phone, you needed one specific machine: an EUV scanner. Room-sized, heavier than a truck, and built by exactly one company on Earth, a Dutch firm called ASML. Each unit costs around $200 million. And here's the part that mattered most. America made sure China could never buy one. Not now, not ever. So the plan was simple, and honestly, it looked airtight. Cut China off from the machine and freeze their chips in the past. Trap them at 14 nanometers, maybe 28 if they got lucky, while the real future kept getting built where it always had. Taiwan, Arizona. The ban was a wall. And everyone on the winning side of that wall relaxed. Then came 2023. A new phone quietly went on sale in China. The Huawei Mate 60 Pro. No big Western launch, no fanfare, it just appeared. And a lab in Canada called Tech Insights did what they always do. They bought one, cracked it open, and sliced the chip into a razor-thin cross-section to see exactly what was inside. What they found stopped people cold. A processor called the Kirin 9000S. And it was a 7-nanometer class chip made by SMIC, China's biggest foundry, on their lines in Shanghai. No EUV scanner in the building. None. Let that sit for a moment. A chip that, by every rule the West had written, simply should not exist. And it wasn't a lab sample. It was already selling in millions of phones, warm in someone's pocket, doing perfectly ordinary things like loading a video and taking a photo. So how do you even make sense of that? To understand why this was supposed to be impossible, you first need to understand what that little word actually means: nanometer. You hear it constantly, and almost nobody explains it. A chip is really just a slab of silicon covered in unbelievably tiny switches. Millions of them, then billions. The nanometer number is basically how small you can draw those switches and the lines connecting them. Smaller lines mean you fit more switches in the same space. More switches means a faster phone, a smarter phone, and one that sips less battery. So the whole race, this entire multi-hundred-billion-dollar industry, comes down to one thing. Who can draw the thinnest lines? And how do you draw them? You don't use a pen. You use light. Picture a projector shining a pattern through a stencil onto a wall. That's the idea. You shine light through a patterned mask onto the silicon wafer, and it prints the design over and over, incredibly small. The finer the light, the finer the lines you can print. Here is the wall. Ordinary lithography light, the kind these factories used for decades, is called EUV. And EUV light has a wavelength that is, in simple terms, too fat. Try to draw a 7-nanometer line with it and the edges smear, like writing tiny letters with a thick marker. It blurs. EUV light is far, far finer. So fine, it can print those thin lines cleanly, in a single clean pass. That's the whole reason the West swore EUV was the only door to the future. Fat light can't draw thin lines. Physics said so. Case closed. Except it wasn't closed. Because SMIC drew those lines anyway, on machines that, by that logic, never should have managed it. And this is exactly the moment where most people stop and shrug, because a single strange chip feels like a fluke. It isn't. That's the thing almost everyone misses. This 7-nanometer chip is not a one-off accident. It's a signal, one data point in a much bigger pattern, and China has been leaving these signals across energy, manufacturing, and technology for years, if you know how to read them. That's actually the whole reason I want to point you to something called the China signal. It's a strategic guide that decodes what China is really building, sector by sector, from semiconductors to energy to manufacturing, so you can see the momentum forming before it ever becomes a headline. Instead of reacting to moves like this Kirin chip after everyone else has, it hands you the framework to spot the early signals yourself and understand why they matter. If that's the kind of edge you want, scan the code on screen or check the link in the description. Okay, back to the mystery, because it's a good one. We've got a machine whose light is physically too thick to draw a 7-nanometer line. We've got a Chinese foundry that was locked out of the only tool that supposedly could. And we've got a finished phone, real, shipped, already in millions of hands, that cannot be walked back no matter how the story gets spun. Those three facts should not fit together. And yet they do. So how do you carve a line finer than your light can print? The answer is a trick with a name: multi-patterning. And it starts with a pen that is too thick to draw the line you actually want. So here is the whole trick, and I promise it isn't magic. You print your first set of lines. Then you etch them into the wafer. Then you shift the pattern just a hair to the side, and you print again. Print, etch, shift, print again. Do that dance 4 times, sometimes more, and a fat dove machine that was never supposed to reach 7 nanometers suddenly carves 7-nanometer detail after all. Think back to that pen. It is too thick to draw the one thin line you actually want, so you don't fight the pen. You draw 2 slightly off lines and let the tiny gap between them be the feature. The gap can be thinner than anything the pen tip could ever make on its own. Stack enough of those passes on top of each other, line them up perfectly, and you build a level of fine detail the light itself could never print in a single shot. I know what you're thinking. Okay, but surely there was a good reason nobody just did this before. And you're right to ask. There was a reason. It's slow, it's expensive, and it is brutally hard to keep every layer lined up. That's exactly why the West treated EUV as the only serious door. Multi-patterning was always the ugly back way in, and most foundries only used it as far as they had to. Try to picture it this way. You're not beating the physics. You're outworking it, one extra pass at a time. And that is precisely what SMIC did. This is the concrete part, the part with a name and a place. SMIC took the ASML DUV scanners they already owned, the older tools they were still legally allowed to buy before the ban clamped down, and ran them through this exact multi-pass process on their Shanghai lines. No smuggled EUV monster hidden in a back room. The same DUV machines everyone knew they had, pushed further than anyone assumed they could go. Now, I have to be honest with you, because this channel is worthless if I'm not, and there are 3 real costs sitting underneath that headline. The first is time and money. Every extra pass is another full trip through the machine. More hours on a tool that runs day and night. More chemicals, more steps, more chances for a speck of dust to ruin the layer. A chip that a single EUV pass could stamp fast, SMIC has to build the slow way 4 times over. That means more machine hours and more money burned into every single wafer that rolls out. The second cost is yield. And yield is a word worth stopping on because it's the whole ballgame. Yield just means how many good chips you get out of one batch of wafers. Bake a tray of 100 cookies, and if 30 come out burnt, your yield is 70. With multi-patterning, every extra pass is another chance to smudge, another shot at knocking the layers out of line. So more wafers come out flawed. The yields run lower, and they get reported quietly, if they get reported at all. The third cost is trust in the numbers. A lot of the boldest scaling claims, the really eye-popping figures about how many of these chips China is churning out, come straight through Chinese state media. So keep a healthy dose of skepticism handy. When a number is designed to make a rival sweat, treat it like a number designed to make a rival sweat. But here's the thing that survives all three of those cautions. Here's the anchor that will not move. The Kirin 9000 is real. Tech Insights didn't read about it in a press release. They cracked open a Huawei Mate 60 Pro and found the thing sitting there, a 7nm class chip stamped by SMIC. And it didn't ship in a handful of demo units for a photo op. It shipped in millions of phones. Real phones, sold to real people. One of them may be already sitting in someone's pocket on your morning train. That part cannot be walked back. You can argue about the yields. You can argue about the cost per chip. You can argue about every scaling figure that state media puts out. But you cannot argue away a chip that is already in millions of hands, doing exactly what everyone swore it could not do without the machine China was never allowed to buy. And now step back and look at what the export ban actually accomplished, because this is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable for the people who drew it up. The ban had one job: freeze China at 14 nanometers, maybe 28, and keep the real future locked in Taiwan and Arizona. Cut off the EUV scanner and slam the door. What it did instead was hand China a problem and a deadline. When you can't buy your way past a wall, you're forced to learn how to build around it. And SMIC didn't just find a one-time workaround for one lucky chip. They turned a limitation into a method, a repeatable process running on legal tools, on lines the West was actively trying to freeze. Print, etch, shift, print again, and do it at production scale. That's the part almost nobody wants to sit with. The wall didn't stop the climb. It taught the climber the route by heart. So the wall did the exact opposite of what it was built to do. And that quietly turns one unremarkable phone into something sharper. A direct threat aimed straight at the two companies who bet their entire future on EUV staying locked behind glass, forever out of China's reach. Two names that have been sitting comfortably at the top of this industry for a very long time: TSMC and Intel. And that threat isn't some far-off boardroom worry. Here's why this reaches all the way to the phone in your own hand. The ban had one job: freeze China at 14 nanometers, maybe 28, and keep the real future locked inside Taiwan and Arizona. It failed at that one job. What it actually did was slow China down and teach them, under pressure, to build around the wall instead of through it. Think about what that means. You wanted to stop a country from learning a skill. Instead, you forced them to learn a harder one. You didn't freeze them. You trained them. Now point that back at the giants. TSMC and Intel didn't just buy the EUV machine. They bet their entire strategy on it staying exclusive. Their whole advantage was a moat, and the moat was this: only they could afford the $200 million scanner. Only they had it, so only they could reach the advanced nodes. That was the deal. That was the safety. And the moment a SMIC carved 7nm detail out of an old legal machine using nothing but that patient multi-pass trick, the pen too thick to draw one thin line, drawn twice to leave the gap, the moat got shallower. Not gone, shallower. And a shallow moat is a very different thing to defend. Because once the method exists, it spreads, It signals cheaper chips flowing out of the exact lines the West tried to freeze. It signals a chip supply that no longer has to run through one Dutch company in one town. For years, every advanced chip on Earth passed through a single choke point, ASML, the only firm that builds EUV scanners at all. One supplier, one country's export rules, one switch that America could flip. That was the leverage. And leverage only works if there's no way around it. Before we go any further, let me ask you one thing. If breakdowns like this are useful to you, hit like and subscribe and turn notifications on. It takes real work to dig through the teardowns and the yield reports and separate what's real from what's hype. And every like genuinely helps more people find this before the headlines catch up. We go deep on shifts like this the moment they happen, while everyone else is still writing the headline. So subscribe so the next one finds you first. Okay, now the part I promised you at the very start. The whole point of the ban, the entire logic of it, was one sentence. Making a 7-nanometer chip at scale is impossible without a machine China cannot buy. That was the assumption the West built its policy on. So sit with where we've landed. The machine sits idle in a warehouse, crated up, covered, never shipped, a $200 million scanner China will never be allowed to touch. And the 7-nanometer phone made without it is already in someone's pocket. Not one phone, millions of them. The Huawei Mate 60 Pro, running the Kirin 9000S, stamped by SMIC in Shanghai, sold and carried and used every single day. That is the whole thing, cashed in full. 7 nanometers, at scale, without a single EUV machine. The impossible product shipped in volume, while the impossible machine gathers dust in storage. And this is the part that keeps the giants awake. It cannot be walked back. You can update an export list. You can tighten a rule. You cannot unship a chip that's already in millions of hands. Now I owe you the honest boundary here, because this is where cheap versions of this story go wrong. This does not mean China caught up everywhere. It doesn't. The real cutting edge, 3 nanometers and 2 nanometers, still strongly favors EUV. At those sizes, the multi-pass trick gets brutal. Every extra pass costs more time, more money, and burns more wafers that come out flawed. And at 3 nanometers, you'd need so many passes that the math stops making sense. So TSMC still owns the very top of the mountain for now. The race is not over. But that was never the claim. The claim is smaller and, honestly, scarier for the people who bet against it. The floor moved. The thing everyone swore required a machine China can't buy just got done without it. The bottom of the ladder that used to be off limits is now open. And a floor that rises tends to keep rising. Which brings us to the one idea I want you to actually walk away with. Technology curves look flat for years. That's the trap. A country runs into the same wall over and over. Everyone watching relaxes. The headlines move on, and the line on the graph just sits there, flat, boring, going nowhere. And then it isn't flat at all. It turns and goes straight up, all at once, and everyone who mistook the flat part for the whole story gets blindsided. Oak Ridge sat on molten salt in the 1960s, and the world called it a dead end. Solar was a toy for decades. Batteries were a joke until they weren't. Flat, 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 and then vertical. That is the shape of this. The chip ban gave us years of flat, and a phone in a pocket just marked the turn. So picture the two images side by side one last time. The machine China was never allowed to buy, sitting in the dark in a warehouse, sealed, idle, worth more than most factories, doing nothing. And the phone that never needed it, warm from someone's hand, doing everything it was supposed to do. One was the whole plan. The other quietly proved the plan wrong. The wall got built to freeze the future in place. Instead, it taught a competitor to climb, and the climbing left a mark that no policy can erase. That's the signal. Not one clever gadget, not one phone, but a curve that just stopped being flat while most of the world was still relaxed. So now, I want to hear from you. This same move, building around the wall instead of through it, is coming for more than chips. Which sector do you think gets rewritten first? Phones, cars, or AI? Drop it below. I read them, and I want to know where you think the curve bends next.